She burst through the bathroom door, her breath ragged, uniform rumpled and smeared with dirt. Her eyes, wild with terror, locked onto the principal's, and in a trembling voice she uttered just 4 words that made the whole school freeze: "He attacked me." The morning at the school started off in its typical fashion, hallways filled with the lively buzz of students exchanging greetings, footsteps echoing against the polished floors, and teachers offering quick smiles as they ushered everyone along to class. Principal Darius Farnwell took note of it all with his usual sense of watchful calm. He was carrying a clipboard with class rosters, planning to verify whether every student had arrived on time. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss, just another day in a large, historic building filled with the usual excitement of children ready to learn. Partway through his rounds, Darius was approached by Martin Rockwell, a physics teacher who looked unusually uneasy. Martin explained that a new student, Evalyn Forrest, hadn't shown up for first period. Since Evalyn had recently shown promise and seemed more engaged in the past few days, her sudden absence concerned him. Darius offered a quick reassurance: perhaps she was just running late, but the knot of worry tightened in his stomach when he recalled that the girl had been trying hard to adjust after her transfer. As he continued down the corridor, Darius caught what sounded like a faint thump. Initially, he assumed it was a dropped book or someone bumping into a locker. But something about the noise made him pause. He took a few steps forward, turned the corner, and froze when he saw a young girl stumbling out of the women's restroom. Her uniform was smeared with dirt, and her hair clung to the sides of her damp, tear-streaked cheeks. When she looked up, he recognized Evalyn Forrest, the very student he had just been searching for. She seemed disoriented and frightened, arms shaking as she struggled to steady herself. Even from a distance, he could see fresh scrapes on her knees and a rip along the hem of her skirt. The stark terror in her eyes made his pulse pound. Without waiting, Darius hurried to her side, gently placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Before he could even ask what had happened, 4 halting words slipped from her trembling lips: "He attacked me." In that instant, the usual commotion of the school hallway faded into silence for Darius. Evalyn clutched at his sleeve as though desperate to find something solid to cling to. His gaze darted past her, toward the restroom she had just escaped. A flickering light inside cast shadows across the tiled floor, and for a split second, he thought he glimpsed movement, yet he couldn't be sure if it was real or a trick of his imagination. The hallway itself was now still, punctuated only by Evalyn's ragged breathing. He looked back at her bruised knees and tear-streaked face, stomach dropping at the thought of a threat lurking so close to his students. Quickly recovering himself, he kept his tone calm and even. He leaned in, speaking quietly so as not to frighten her further. "Evalyn, it's all right. You're safe now. We're going to get you help." Despite his steady words, panic seemed to ripple outward. A teacher who was passing by rushed over, eyes wide, and a few students slowed their steps, whispering in anxious confusion as they tried to grasp what was happening. Darius knew he had to move Evalyn somewhere safer, away from prying eyes. Gently, he guided her down the corridor, every fiber of his being braced with a new awareness: there might be someone dangerous in his school, and he had no idea who it was or where they had gone. Darius led Evalyn down the corridor, careful not to move too quickly so she wouldn't feel rushed or overwhelmed. Despite his soothing words, her grip on his sleeve never loosened. Curious whispers trailed after them. A group of 7th graders paused mid-conversation as they noticed Evalyn's tear-streaked face and disheveled clothing. The sight alone was enough to fuel the undercurrent of tension already forming in the hallway. A few teachers emerged from nearby classrooms, drawn by the obvious distress. Ms. Sandridge, a soft-spoken literature instructor, hurried over and asked if they should call an ambulance. Darius shook his head for now, saying firmly but calmly, "Get the school nurse, and please keep the students in class. We need to avoid panic." Ms. Sandridge nodded and rushed off, determined to do her part. Still trembling, Evalyn clung to Darius as he guided her toward the safety of his office. With each step, she glanced behind them, as if afraid the person who attacked her might appear at any moment. Darius's every sense was on alert. He couldn't help but scan every open doorway, every corner, fearing the possibility that someone dangerous was lurking just out of sight. When they reached his office, Darius flicked on the overhead light, illuminating the rows of books and files that lined the shelves. It was normally a comforting space. He prided himself on keeping it a welcoming haven for students. But today, the air felt charged. He helped Evalyn into one of the plush chairs near his desk, noticing her uniform was smudged with grime at the knees and elbows, the fabric slightly torn near the hem. Harvey Cator, Darius's assistant, arrived moments later, nearly skidding to a stop in the doorway. Concern pinched his features as he took in Evalyn's state. "Principal Farnwell, is she?" "We need the nurse," Darius cut in gently, nodding in Evalyn's direction. "And please notify campus security. They should start checking the halls, the restrooms, anywhere someone might be hiding." Harvey's eyes widened in alarm, but he recovered quickly, pulling out his phone to make the calls. "Right away," he said before disappearing back into the corridor. Left alone with Evalyn for a moment, Darius knelt beside her chair. He spoke softly, trying to keep her eyes on him rather than on the open door. "Can you tell me if you saw who it was or what he looked like? Anything at all you remember might help." Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced around as though she expected the walls themselves might betray her secret. I didn't see much. It was dark in there because the light kept flickering. I just remember, he was tall, maybe wearing a hoodie. He grabbed me and I fell." Darius nodded, absorbing her words. He couldn't help but feel a surge of protective anger that someone had dared assault a child in his school. As he was about to ask more, the nurse hurried inside with a small first aid kit. She immediately took Evalyn's hands in her own, examining the scraped skin on her palms and the bruises forming on her forearms. Evalyn winced at the gentle touch but stayed remarkably still. While the nurse dabbed an antiseptic wipe over the cuts, Darius glanced at Evalyn's face, noticing fresh tears that had begun welling up in her eyes. He realized she was holding her breath, perhaps trying to keep from breaking down completely. "It's okay," Darius said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're allowed to cry. You're safe here." Though she didn't fully relax, Evalyn let out a shuddering sigh, and a tear slipped free. The nurse offered a tissue with a kind smile. In that moment, the faint echo of hurried footsteps and voices out in the hall reminded everyone that the situation was far from over. Somewhere in the building, there could still be a threat. But for now, Evalyn was in safe hands. Darius silently vowed he would do everything possible to keep it that way. Harvey returned, standing at the threshold of the office with an anxious expression. "Security is sweeping the hallways now. They haven't found anyone matching Evalyn's description yet, but they're checking every corner. What else do we need?" Darius rose from his kneeling position, turning to face his assistant. "Call the police," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't want to take any risks. There could be a trespasser on campus, and we have no idea what his intentions are." Harvey gave a firm nod and slipped back into the corridor. Through the open door, Darius could hear distant murmurs of teachers trying to maintain order in the classrooms while students sensed that something was seriously wrong. Attention gripped the entire wing, like the hush before a storm. Evalyn glanced nervously at the nurse, who continued to dab antiseptic on her scrapes. Now that the immediate shock was wearing off, she began to shiver, though the temperature in the office was far from cold. Darius gently draped a light blanket around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," Evalyn whispered, her voice catching. "I must have done something stupid. I went in to see if someone was hurt because I heard a noise. I should have just walked away." "It's not your fault," Darius assured her. He recognized the guilt in her tone. Victims often blamed themselves. "You showed concern, and that's not a mistake. The person who did this is the only one to blame." The nurse offered a nod of agreement. "He's right, dear. You did nothing wrong. A tap on the doorframe caught their attention. Ms. Sandridge stood there, looking troubled. "Principal Farnwell, there's a rumor going around that we're on lockdown. Should I confirm that, or do you want me to try to keep classes running normally?" Darius weighed the options. Panicking the students could have consequences, but so could pretending nothing was happening. He looked at Avalon's bruised arms and thought about the possibility of someone dangerous still roaming the halls. "Let's implement a soft lockdown," he decided. "Teachers should keep students in their classrooms. We won't ring the bell for class changes. We'll try to keep everyone calm and safe until the police arrive." Ms. Sandridge nodded and disappeared again. Almost immediately, the intercom crackled to life with Darius's voice, announcing the soft lockdown protocol in measured tones. He kept his explanation vague, mentioning a security concern without specifying the details. The finality of his words, however, echoed in the hallways, sparking a ripple of subdued anxiety. Avalon's grip on the blanket tightened. "Is he still here?" she asked quietly, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. "We don't know," Darius admitted, "but security is looking. The police are on their way. Whoever he is, I promise you we're going to do everything we can to find him." Even as he spoke, he felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. The school, his students, and now Avalon's very sense of safety, it all depended on how quickly they could track down whoever had dared to attack her in a place meant for learning and protection. Looking at the frightened child before him, Darius silently vowed that he would not rest until the threat was gone. In the tense quiet that followed the lockdown announcement, Darius stepped out of his office momentarily to confer with Harvey. They stood near the front entrance, where a few worried parents had begun to gather outside, having caught wind of something amiss through text messages from their children. Harvey, phone clutched in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other, tried to reassure them through the glass doors, explaining that everyone was safe inside and the police were en route. A tall security officer named Emmett appeared at the end of the hallway, sweat beading on his brow. "We've checked most of the first floor," he said. No sign of anyone matching the description Avalon gave. "I sent another guard to start on the second-floor corridors." Darius nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Emmett. Keep me updated, and make sure no one enters or leaves until the police say otherwise." As Emmett jogged off, Darius became acutely aware of how silent the building was. Normally, a lockdown meant shutting off the lights and keeping everyone out of sight, but because this was only a soft lockdown, classrooms still had their lights on. He could almost feel the collective breath-holding happening behind each closed door. He returned to his office to check on Avalon, only to find her in conversation with the school nurse, who was gently encouraging her to stay hydrated. The girl looked pale, but she appeared slightly calmer, no longer gripping the arms of the chair so tightly. "Principal Farnwell," she said softly, her voice still trembling. "Are the police going to talk to me?" "They might ask you more questions when they arrive," Darius replied, keeping his tone as gentle as possible. "But you only have to talk if you feel ready. Right now, your well-being is the priority." Avalon nodded, inhaling shakily. "He never said a word," she added, almost to herself. "I can't remember his face, just his size. And it was dark." Darius exchanged a look with the nurse, realizing how limited that information was. Yet it was all they had to go on. "You're doing the right thing by telling us everything you can, even if it feels small," he said. "Sometimes little details add up to something bigger." Before Avalon could respond, the faint sound of sirens drifted in through the closed windows. A flicker of relief crossed her features, and Darius's pulse quickened with a mixture of hope and dread. The authorities were here, which meant help had arrived, but it also meant delving deeper into the reality that someone with malicious intent had slipped into the school. Harvey peeked his head in the doorway. "The police have just arrived, Darius. They want to set up a command post in the conference room. Should I escort them?" Darius nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Avalon's shoulder as he passed. "I'll be there in a moment," he told Harvey. Then, turning back to Avalon, he offered the faintest smile he could manage. "Stay with the nurse for now, okay? This is the safest place for you. I promise we'll figure this out." Her eyes were large and fearful, but she managed a slight nod. Darius could only hope that the calming effect of professional officers and a more systematic search would help contain the situation, and lead them to whoever had shaken Avalon's sense of safety so profoundly. As soon as Darius stepped into the conference room, he saw two uniformed officers and a detective in plain clothes arranging their files and laptops on the large wooden table. They introduced themselves, Detective Gray, Officer Morales, and Officer Ridge, and immediately began asking Darius about the layout of the school, the locations of all exits, and the exact timeline of events. Harvey hovered nearby, ready to supply any paperwork or information they might need, though his face betrayed the strain of the day's unfolding crisis. Darius explained what Avalon had managed to share, how she entered the restroom, noticed a flickering light, and was suddenly grabbed by an unknown figure in dark clothing. He also mentioned that she'd been too rattled to describe facial features, height, or other details with any precision. Detective Gray grimaced, tapping a pen on his notepad in clear frustration. "That's not much to go on," he muttered, then glanced at Harvey. "We'll need access to any security camera footage, even if the relevant cameras were down. Sometimes peripheral angles can show us who entered or left the restroom area." Harvey nodded, opening a laptop with a quick flurry of keystrokes. "We have cameras in the main corridors, the cafeteria, and near some entrances, but the unit covering that hallway's restroom is currently under repair," he admitted. "I can show you what we do have." Officer Morales checked the building map they'd laid out, running a finger along the corridors. "Even partial footage might help us track movements through adjacent hallways," she said. "What about staff sign-ins for today, or any visitors scheduled?" Darius reached into a nearby drawer, producing a thin folder of documents. "I've got a record here of every visitor who checked in at the front desk. As for staff, we do keep an electronic system, which Harvey can pull up. But we've had some employees call out sick on short notice. Nothing that seemed suspicious initially, but I'll get you that list." Before they could delve further, Emmett, the security officer, appeared in the doorway. His radio crackled with reports of the ongoing search. "We've cleared the second floor," he said, voice tight with the adrenaline of the moment. "No one matching Avalon's description. We're starting on the basement storage and mechanical rooms now." Detective Gray thanked him, then turned back to Darius. "At this point, we're also considering the possibility that the attacker fled. If he knew the layout, he could have slipped out a side exit before anyone realized what happened. But we won't rule out that he's still hiding somewhere on campus." Those words brought a fresh wave of apprehension crashing down on Darius. The idea of a dangerous individual potentially still within the school's walls, while hundreds of students and staff waited in their classrooms, was nearly overwhelming. Yet he forced himself to stay focused. There was no time for fear, not while Avalon and everyone else counted on him to keep them safe. "Well," he said, lifting his chin with resolve, "we have a job to do. Let's make sure no corner of this building goes unchecked." The officers nodded, and Harvey pulled up the digital logs on his screen. With each new piece of data, they built a more precise picture of that morning's movements inside the school. Minutes ticked by, measured in the steady hum of the overhead lights and the tense whispers passing between the police and the school officials. Somewhere beyond the conference room doors, the corridors lay in forced silence, each classroom a cocoon of uneasy quiet, while outside, a handful of parents still lingered, peering anxiously through the windows for any sign of resolution. And in the nurse's station, a frightened fifth-grade girl waited, trying to steady her breathing, hoping the next footsteps she heard would bring good news. It was nearly midday, and the tension in the school had transformed into a palpable undercurrent of anxiety. Teachers kept their classes contained, quietly reassuring restless students that they were simply following safety protocols. Outside, a few alarmed parents were steadily growing in number, some holding onto their phones, awaiting text messages from their children. Through the conference room windows, Darius could see them exchanging worried glances. Inside, Detective Gray and Officer Morales went through the visitor logs, comparing them to footage from the functioning security cameras. Occasionally, they'd pause to highlight a name or time stamp, asking Darius or Harvey if anything stood out. The process was slow and painstaking, but necessary. Every so often, one of them would step out into the corridor to update their colleagues who were completing the physical search of the school's nooks and crannies. Emmett, the security officer, returned with a slight shake of his head. "The basement area is clear," he said. "We checked the boiler room, the storage closets, and even the maintenance tunnels that lead to the utility exit. Nothing unusual." Officer Morales made a brief note. "Any sign of forced locks or doors propped open?" "Not yet," Emmett replied. "That's what makes this so unnerving. It's like he vanished into thin air." Meanwhile, Darius slipped out of the conference room to check on Evelyn. He found her still in the nurse's station, quietly sipping water. The nurse had managed to calm her a little, her breathing was more regular now, but her face remained drawn with worry. At the sight of Darius, Evelyn sat up slightly, setting down the paper cup. "Have they found him?" she asked, her voice subdued yet laced with hope. "Not yet," Darius admitted gently. "But the police are being very thorough. They're checking every possible place he could hide." Evelyn nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I'm sorry for causing all this trouble," she murmured, eyes dropping to her lap. Darius crouched beside her chair, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You didn't cause anything, Evelyn. I'm just grateful you're safe. That's all that matters right now." Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but she held them back, giving him a tiny nod. The nurse stepped in, offering a comforting hand on Evelyn's shoulder. Darius stood, swallowing the wave of emotion that rose in his chest. This child had gone through something terrifying, ensuring she felt no guilt or shame was every bit as important as apprehending whoever had attacked her. Stepping back into the corridor, he found Harvey waiting. The assistant gave him a tight smile. "We cross-referenced the staff call-outs and the new hires over the last few months," Harvey said. One name came up, Romney Hoyt, a recently hired custodian. "He's been absent for a week, claiming a family emergency. His paperwork was a bit thin." Darius felt a slight jolt of unease. "Did we confirm his references?" Harvey shrugged helplessly. "They checked out at first glance, but they're from out of state. It's possible we didn't dig deep enough." Darius mulled over this information, recalling that he'd never actually met Romney in person, just signed off on the final hire after a cursory interview handled by another administrator. It was a slim lead, but it was a lead nonetheless. Clutching the folder with the custodian's file, Darius headed back toward the conference room. The possibility that an inside employee might be involved was chilling, but they couldn't overlook any clue. As he walked, he passed classroom doors with anxious faces peering through narrow windows. He felt the weight of each pair of eyes upon him, an unspoken plea for reassurance that everything would be all right. He kept his pace steady and his posture firm, even though inside he was every bit as unsettled as they were. Darius walked briskly back to the conference room, clutching Romney Hoyt's thin file against his chest. Inside, Detective Gray and Officer Morales were reviewing the security footage for the third time, their eyes keen for even the smallest discrepancy. Harvey stood nearby, glancing over their shoulders, looking for any movement in the grainy recordings that might offer a clue. When Darius entered, he cleared his throat, and all three turned to face him. "Harvey and I uncovered a name that might be worth investigating," Darius said, placing the folder on the conference table. "Romney Hoyt, a custodian hired a few weeks ago. He's been absent this past week without clear documentation. And, well, his background checks might not have been as thorough as we believed." Detective Gray lowered his reading glasses and picked up the file. "What do you know about him?" "Not much," Darius replied, feeling a renewed pang of guilt. He submitted a short resume, had 2 reference letters from out of state. Claimed he needed this job to move closer to family. But no one in the office remembers seeing him often, and he supposedly worked a late shift. Officer Morales scanned the pages quickly. Nothing here about his previous addresses, no photo ID copies. Just a phone number and references that might be fabricated. Her gaze flicked up to meet Darius's. It's possible we're dealing with a false identity. Harvey frowned. You think this Hoyt person could have been lurking around, using a key or access card to slip in undetected? It's a lead, Detective Gray said cautiously. We can't say for sure he's the attacker, but we'd be negligent not to check. I'll put out a request to see if he has any criminal history under that name, or if this is an alias for someone else. As if on cue, Emmett, the security officer, tapped on the conference room door. He held out a small ring of keys. Found these near the loading dock entrance. They look official, one of them matches our school's master lock pattern. Could be janitorial keys. Darius felt a chill at the back of his neck. We keep close track of copies, he murmured. But if Hoyt made a duplicate or if he was given a spare. Harvey exhaled a tense breath, finishing the thought, then he'd have no trouble letting himself in or out any time he wanted. Detective Gray slid the set of keys into an evidence bag. We'll check if the engravings match the ones issued to your custodial staff. In the meantime, it might be best if we discreetly interview some of the other employees, night shift, custodians, maintenance, anyone who might have seen Hoyt or someone resembling him hanging around. Darius nodded, though his stomach twisted. The soft lockdown had already stretched on for hours, fraying everyone's nerves. But the idea that the person who attacked Avalon might be an actual staff member, or someone posing as one, made the weight on his chest even heavier. He glanced at Harvey, who gave a firm, understanding nod. They knew what had to be done. We'll cooperate fully, Darius assured the officers. Whatever you need, interviews, records, anything. Detective Gray flicked through the file once more. One more thing, does Avalon recall anything unique about her attacker? A voice, a smell, anything else aside from the darkness of his clothing? She mentioned a flickering light in barely seeing his face, Darius said. She thought he wore a hood or something similar. No mention of distinct markings or speech. Understood, Officer Morales replied. We'll keep digging. She closed the folder. In the meantime, keep your staff calm and stay accessible if we have more questions. Darius watched as the officers gathered their notes, then proceeded toward the door, ready to begin a new round of interviews. Harvey followed, offering to organize a list of employees for them. Alone for a moment in the conference room, Darius let out a slow breath, staring at the battered folder on the table. If Romney Hoyt was indeed behind the attack, it meant the danger had come from within their own walls, a thought that left him colder than ever. His only solace was that the police were now zeroing in on a suspect, bringing the school one step closer to a resolution and, he fervently hoped, Avalon one step closer to feeling safe again. Darius spent a few tense minutes alone in the conference room before stepping back into the corridor to join the officers. He found them gathered by a row of lockers, interviewing one of the night shift custodians who had just arrived for a later shift. The man's expression was a study in confusion, his hands shaking slightly as he insisted he hadn't seen or heard from Romney Hoyt in over a week. Detective Gray took notes methodically, while Officer Morales scanned the man's ID badge with practiced scrutiny. Emmett hurried over, walkie-talkie crackling with chatter. He reported that half the classrooms had been checked, with teachers asked individually if they had ever seen Hoyt lingering in areas he wasn't assigned to. Some recalled brief sightings of a tall, quiet man wearing a hooded sweatshirt after hours, but no one had spoken to him enough to gather any details. A few staff members mentioned hearing faint noises late in the evening, heavy footsteps, the scrape of a door, but had dismissed them as normal maintenance activity. Emmett pressed his lips together, adding that the entire situation felt more unsettling with each new piece of information. Darius, feeling the weight of all those questioning eyes, thanked Emmett and then moved to the far side of the hallway. His gaze traveled to the nurse's station door, where Evalyn remained under the nurse's gentle care. He couldn't shake the image of her tear-streaked face. Even after hours of investigation, they were no closer to confirming Hoyt's involvement or finding any concrete evidence beyond the keys. The police presence only underscored how real the danger might be. Suddenly, a call crackled over Emmett's radio. One of the officers on the western side of the building had spotted movement near the old supply wing, an area rarely used except for storing old desks and equipment. Detective Gray and Officer Morales exchanged sharp glances, then waved for Darius to stay put while they and a small team sprinted down the hall. Unable to remain idle, Darius followed at a quick jog, passing curious teachers who peeked out of classrooms, their faces etched with worry. The supply wing felt like a different world. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows across chipped tile floors. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated by the intermittent glow. At the far end of the corridor, two officers stood outside a heavy metal door that led to an old, rarely used storeroom. There was a hushed urgency as everyone formed a cautious semicircle. Detective Gray, flashlight in hand, turned the knob. It resisted, as if something blocked it from the inside. One of the officers nodded, indicating they were prepared to force entry. With a firm heave, they managed to push the door open, revealing a dimly lit space crowded with surplus furniture. In one corner, the shadowy outline of a person crouched low behind a stack of tables. Darius held his breath as the officers fanned out, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Detective Gray gave a clear order to show hands, voice echoing in the confined space. At first, there was no movement, only silence. Then, with a scraping sound, the figure darted to the left in a desperate bid to escape through a side door. Two officers moved fast, blocking the path. A brief scuffle ensued, chairs knocking over with a jarring clang. Darius caught a glimpse of a hooded sweatshirt, the edge of a drawn, panicked face, and then the suspect was pinned against a wall. It took only seconds for the officers to confirm he was carrying a set of keys identical to the ones found near the loading dock. His eyes darted around, wild and cornered, as he spewed curses under his breath. Detective Gray stripped the hood back, revealing features that matched the faint descriptions from staff accounts. The suspect was indeed Romney Hoyt, or whoever he truly was behind that name. Darius felt both revulsion and relief in the pit of his stomach, realizing that if they hadn't found him, he might have hidden in the school indefinitely, or worse, harmed someone else. Once Hoyt was secured in handcuffs, Officer Morales radioed the all-clear. A trembling exhale swept through the officers, like the release of a collective breath they'd all been holding. Emmett stepped aside to let them lead the suspect out, and Darius could only watch as the man glared defiantly at anyone in his line of sight. In that hostile gaze, he sensed a twisted bitterness, though whether it was directed at the school, Evalyn, or life in general was impossible to say. As soon as word reached the rest of the building that the suspect was in custody, the tension that had pressed down on the school like a heavy weight began to ease. Classrooms slowly reopened, and parents gathered outside were informed that the threat had been neutralized. Some erupted into tears of relief, while others demanded to know how such a person had slipped through hiring procedures in the first place. Darius did his best to address their concerns, though shame and exhaustion warred within him at the realization that the school's vulnerability had been so easily exploited. In the aftermath, Darius checked on Evalyn. She was perched on the edge of the nurse's cot, twisting her hands nervously. The moment she spotted him, her eyes locked onto his, searching for an answer. He mustered a gentle smile and told her, "They found him. You're safe." Evalyn's shoulders sagged in relief, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, though the weight of her trauma was still evident in her trembling voice. Darius placed a hand on her shoulder, quietly assuring her that the school would provide whatever support she needed in the coming days. Later, As the police cars pulled away and the lockdown finally lifted, Darius took a moment to stand by the main entrance. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting a warm, orange glow across the schoolyard. He watched families reunite, teachers exchange weary embraces, and students file out with mixed expressions of fatigue and relief. Though a heavy day's work lay behind them, the real task, restoring a sense of safety, had only just begun. Harvey approached, placing a hand on Darius's shoulder. They shared a long, silent look, each feeling the gravity of what had transpired. Darius offered a slight nod, silently promising that they would not allow such a breach to happen again. Somewhere behind them, a lock clicked, the echo reverberating through the hallway, a small but potent symbol that this time, at least, the darkness had been shut out. Darius stood in the now quiet corridor, the echoes of the day's chaos still resonating in his mind. Though the immediate crisis had passed with Romney Hoyt's capture, the emotional toll was everywhere, visible in the tear-stained faces of students walking out, in the subdued way teachers locked up their classrooms, and in his own fatigue that felt bone-deep. He took a moment just to breathe, pressing his palm against the cool metal of a locker as though anchoring himself back to reality. A sudden vibration in his pocket broke the stillness. Fishing out his phone, he saw that it was Courtney Forrest, Avalon's mother. Anxiety tugged at him as he answered. Her voice sounded both relieved and shaken. "Principal Farnwell," Courtney began, "I just wanted to thank you for calling me right away. And for everything you did to protect Avalon today. She's quiet, but at least she's home safe." Darius allowed himself a slight, weary smile. "I'm relieved to hear she's with you. The officers will likely reach out for more details once Avalon has rested." A short pause followed before Courtney softly added, "She's worried, you know, asking if she'll ever feel normal at school again." The question tugged at Darius's heart. "It'll take time," he said gently. "We have a counselor on staff ready to help, and we'll bring in additional support if needed. Tell Avalon she's not alone in this." After he ended the call, Darius found himself thinking about the day's events in slow motion, Avalon's panicked face, the frantic searches, the moment of the suspect's capture. Each memory felt like a vivid snapshot he couldn't quite file away. He decided to check on the faculty lounge, where some teachers had gathered to debrief and catch their breath. Inside, an uneasy hush filled the room. Ms. Sandridge stood near the window, hugging her elbows, while Mr. Rockwell paced by the vending machine. They offered Darius solemn nods as he entered. "They're going to ask how this happened," Ms. Sandridge said, her voice trembling with residual stress. "Parents, the district, everyone. And honestly, I'm not sure what we'll tell them." "We'll tell them the truth," Darius replied quietly. "That our checks weren't thorough enough, that we let someone slip through the cracks. But also that when it mattered, we came together to protect our students. We contained the threat." Mr. Rockwell raked a hand through his hair. "Doesn't feel like a victory, though." Darius nodded in rueful agreement. "I know. But we have to focus on what comes next, supporting Avalon, reassuring parents, and making sure this can never happen again." A heavy silence settled over the lounge. The teachers, normally so full of chatter, seemed drained. Stepping further into the room, Darius gently laid a hand on Ms. Sandridge's shoulder. "Take the weekend to rest," he urged quietly. "We'll hold a staff meeting first thing Monday morning to discuss new safety protocols and counseling resources. For now, just try to breathe." She gave him a wavering smile, tears shimmering at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, Principal Farnwell." Outside in the hallway, the last of the police presence was tapering off. Darius walked them to the main entrance, exchanging phone numbers with Detective Gray, who promised to keep him updated on Hoyt's pending charges. As the detective stepped out into the fading daylight, Darius lingered by the door, letting the hush of the empty school wash over him. Tomorrow, everything would look the same lockers, the same corridors, but he knew the community's trust had been cracked. It would be his mission to repair it, one conversation at a time. Gathering his keys, he closed the heavy entrance doors and ensured they were locked. The final echo of the latch felt symbolic, shutting away the day's horrors, albeit knowing the emotional aftermath would linger. Even so, as he turned off the lights and headed home, he carried a flicker of resolve in his chest. Avalon would heal, the school would become safer, and they would all learn from this harrowing experience, no matter how steep the cost. Darius returned to the school early the next morning, the sky still streaked with dawn's pale light. He unlocked the main entrance and stepped into the empty hallway, the echo of his footsteps reminding him how different it felt compared to the turmoil of the previous day. Though the air was cool and still, he knew the building held an undercurrent of tension, traces of fear that would take time to dispel. In the staff room, he found Ms. Sandridge, Mr. Rockwell, and a few other teachers gathered around a large table. Their faces bore the fatigue of a restless night, but they offered small smiles in greeting. Darius placed a stack of papers before them, a new safety checklist, an updated emergency plan, and contact information for crisis counselors. He'd worked on these documents late into the night. "We'll start this morning with a briefing," he explained. "I want everyone on the same page about our new procedures. After that, we'll address any questions the students might have. Honesty is important right now. We can't pretend yesterday didn't happen." A hush fell as he spoke. Each teacher appeared weighed down by both personal anxiety and concern for their students. Eventually, Miss Sandridge broke the silence. "What about Avalon? Is she coming in today?" Darius exhaled slowly. "Her mother said she'd let Avalon decide. The school counselor is ready to meet with her, or with anyone else who feels shaken by what happened. I plan to check in on her throughout the day if she does come." A moment later, Harvey arrived with a pot of fresh coffee, placing paper cups around the table. The comforting aroma helped break some of the tension. When the last teacher settled in, Darius began reviewing the new measures: mandatory ID checks at every entrance, a more rigorous vetting process for future hires, and additional training for the existing security staff. He stressed that transparency and unity were key. Each staff member had a responsibility to look out for signs of distress or suspicious behavior, and no concern was too minor to report. As they finished, Mr. Rockwell raised a hand. "And the parents? What's our message to them?" Darius's lips quirked in a subdued smile. "That we're listening and learning. We'll hold a forum tomorrow evening. They'll have questions, rightfully so, and we have to be prepared to answer them candidly. Our main goal is to rebuild trust." He thanked everyone for coming in so early and dismissed them to their classrooms. The teachers departed with a collective quiet resolve. In the hallway, Darius paused when he saw a figure standing by the front doors, Courtney Forrest, guiding Avalon by the hand. The girl looked anxious, but determination shone in her eyes. Darius approached with a careful smile. "Welcome back, Avalon," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" She hesitated, glancing at her mother before giving a small shrug. "I'm okay, I guess. Nervous." Her fingers worried at the strap of her backpack. "But I don't want to hide at home." Courtney's gaze darted between her daughter and the principal. "We'll take it one step at a time," she murmured, hugging Avalon's shoulders protectively. Darius nodded. "I'm glad you're here. The counselor's office is open whenever you need it, and if you'd rather not go to class right away, that's perfectly fine." Avalon squared her shoulders, as if mustering courage. I think I'll go to homeroom," she replied, voice quivering just a touch. Courtney gave Darius a grateful glance and whispered something to her daughter before letting her follow the trickle of arriving students. As Avalon disappeared down the hall, Darius felt a wave of respect for her bravery. He turned to Courtney, who stood watching with tears forming at the edges of her eyes. "She wants normalcy," Courtney said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "And we'll do our best to give it to her," Darius promised. After Courtney left, Darius made his way through the school one corridor at a time. He popped into classrooms, talking with students who had questions. Many were still on edge, some angry, some frightened, but a sense of collective resolve was beginning to take shape. Teachers paused their lessons to address concerns openly, echoing Darius's sentiment, that the best way forward was together, vigilant and supportive. Midday came, and Darius stopped by Evalin's homeroom. She sat at her desk, looking weary yet determined, her pencil tracing slow circles in her notebook. When he caught her eye, she managed a tiny smile. It wasn't a smile free of fear, he knew that kind of recovery would take time, but it was a step toward healing. By afternoon, the school felt steadier. Students shared cautious laughter between classes, teachers returned to normal routines while integrating discussions about safety and empathy. The final bell rang in a soft crescendo of relief and hope. Outside, the sun bathed the schoolyard in warm light, as though reminding everyone that darkness, no matter how frightening, wasn't permanent. Darius lingered by the main entrance again, watching parents reunite with their children. It felt different from the day before, no police cars, no frantic energy. Just families heading home, each conversation a little more earnest, each goodbye a little more heartfelt. When Evalin and Courtney approached, Darius gave them both a gentle wave. Evalin met his gaze, a spark of gratitude flickering in her eyes. Once they were gone, he stood in the doorway, listening to the echoes of footsteps fade to silence. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more demands, and no small amount of scrutiny. But the promise of a stronger, safer environment guided him now. He locked up the school, pocketing the keys with a renewed sense of purpose. Though the scars left by yesterday's ordeal would not vanish overnight, they would serve as a reminder of the responsibility he and the entire community held, to protect and nurture every child under this roof, no matter what shadows attempted to enter. In my view, the ending highlights both relief and the lingering weight of what happened. While the immediate threat is resolved by the capture of the attacker, the emotional impact doesn't vanish overnight. Evalin and the school community still face the task of healing from a sudden betrayal of their sense of safety. In a way, the story's conclusion underscores resilience. It shows how a single jarring incident can draw people together, leading to stronger security measures and a renewed commitment to protect one another. Yet it also serves as a reminder that vigilance is essential, and that even seemingly secure spaces require constant care and attention to truly remain safe. Ultimately, the resolution feels hopeful, but it doesn't deny the reality that everyone involved must process their experiences and work toward rebuilding a sense of trust in the place they once took for granted.